All right, well, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to this debate. The topic this evening, as you know, is about William F. Buckley Jr., and the question is, was he a conservative or was he a libertarian? Now, the reason that I am moderating this, at least one of them, is that my answer as the author of the book, The Conservatarian Manifesto, is that he was both, and that wouldn't have been a very entertaining thing to debate. I'd have been essentially arguing with myself. So instead, we thought we would have these two gentlemen to ham it out. Now, I think Buckley's reach was extraordinary. You all know about it. But last night I was in this hotel, and I was on my own, and I went and I sat at the bar. Most of my stories start like that. And I met a lady from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who was very different than me. And we got chatting about sports, and then it got onto politics. And I would say I probably disagreed with her about 90% of political issues. But she said, "What are you doing here?" And I mentioned William F. Buckley, and she said, "Oh, I love Firing Line." And we got chatting about it, and she really did. She loved watching Buckley in the 70s and 80s. She enjoyed the open dialogue of Firing Line, and she knew all of these touchstones. And I thought, this is great. I mean, this is a good example of Buckley's reach. It's also a good example of the importance of civil discourse and small L liberalism. And with that in mind, I thought I would just start this before we get going with a quick moment to address what happened to Charlie Cooke. I thought what I should say about this that wasn't obvious, and this is what I came up with. My kids know that I work in politics. I don't talk to them about politics all the time because they're 7 and 9, and I want them to enjoy their childhood. But they ask questions. They are already instinctively relatively conservative. They're horrified by the idea of taxes. And they go to Catholic school, so they're already somewhat traditional. But the one thing I always say to them when they ask questions is, look, people disagree, and good people disagree. And people of different races and religions and backgrounds disagree. And the two things that I just think are more important than anything else are, don't judge people by the color of their skin, and don't hurt people who disagree with you. And what we saw, unfortunately, last week was the latter. In other words, the most basic rule of our society was violated. The foundation of our society was violated. So before we get going, I think Michael has a quick few words to offer about Charlie Cooke, and then we'll get into the debate.
Thank you, Charlie. Charlie Cooke is, as I think a lot of people come to realize, if they hadn't already, an irreplaceable figure in the conservative movement as it is right now. He performed a kind of function of, reconciling different generations, different factions of this movement with each other. And I thought, what we lost last week wasn't just a man, but was also the virtues he brought into the public arena. And I asked myself when we were discussing what to do, I said I wanted to offer a prayer. And so I found a prayer from St. Anselm for zeal. And I think zeal is the virtue that Charlie Cooke demonstrated. Zeal is defined as love in action, the ardor of charity that moves one to advance goodness. So I'd just like to call a moment of silence, and then I'll say this prayer from St. Anselm. O Almighty and merciful Father, who pourest thy benefits upon us, Forgive the unthankfulness with which we have requited thy goodness. We have remained before thee with dead and senseless hearts, unkindled with love of thy gentle and enduring goodness. Turn thou us, O merciful Father, and so we shall be turned. Make us with our whole heart to hunger and thirst after thee, and with all our longing to desire thee. Make us with our whole heart to serve thee alone, and with all our zeal to seek those things which are well-pleasing in thy sight. For the sake of thine only begotten Son, to whom with thee and the Holy Ghost be all honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael. And now to the debate. So it is my pleasure to introduce, as if he needed introduction, he's already stood up, Michael Brendan Dougherty, who is a colleague of mine, is a friend of mine, is a sparring partner of mine. Those who listen to the Editors podcast will know sometimes we go at it, and Michael is also a senior writer at National Review alongside me. And then we have Daniel McCarthy, who is the editor of Modern Age, and columnist at The Spectator. And I think this is still right. You're a contributing editor, The American Conservative. Is that correct? Good. Okay, excellent. I didn't screw that up. So the topic, as I said, is about William F. Buckley, who would have been 100 this year. What was he? Was he a conservative? Was he a libertarian? What do those terms mean? What did they mean to him? How much did he help invent them? And we're going to start with you, Dan. If you want to make your opening statement, you have 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. We will indeed get started by talking about these terms themselves, and the fact that we use the word conservative the way that we do today, and the way that we have, in fact, for more than a generation, is a testament to William F. Buckley Jr.'s success in redefining conservatism, redefining the American right, as essentially a form of libertarianism. Some might say right liberalism, some might say classical liberalism, but the idea that conservatism is fundamentally a form of libertarianism or liberalism is something that William F. Buckley Jr. is largely responsible for having achieved. Now, Buckley himself begins his career in the 1950s. In 1951, he publishes his first book, God and Man at Yale. This is a few years before the founding of National Review in 1955. In God and Man at Yale, Buckley refers to himself throughout as an individualist. That's his political identification. He is strongly influenced by not only his father, who is a businessman of very strong libertarian convictions, but also by one of his father's close friends, an intellectual by the name of Albert J. Nock. Nock, by the way, is not just a libertarian, but in fact self-identified as an anarchist, an elitist anarchist. So not the sort of Bakuninite or bomb-throwing types you might know of, but rather as a very Olympian, someone who rejected not only mass democracy, but the entire apparatus of the modern state in a sense of nobility and libertarian aristocratic defiance of modernity. If you are familiar with Alexis de Tocqueville, you'll know that Tocqueville considers liberty to be very much characteristically an aristocratic concern. And Albert J. Nock, he was not an aristocrat by birth, but he was an aristocrat of the spirit. And indeed, the Buckleys, both Will Buckley and his son, William F. Buckley Jr., have that sense of aristocratic libertarianism in their blood and in their very character. So William F. Buckley Jr. begins by thinking of himself as an individualist, calling himself an individualist in his book. By the way, one of the hats I wear is as a vice president at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which is an organization of which Bill Buckley was the very first president. Now, the secret history of ISI is that it was founded by a journalist who was a sort of apprentice to or apostle of Albert J. Nock by the name of Frank Chodorov. So Frank Chodorov was the person who first came up with the idea of what he then called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. So ISI itself, which is now very strongly identified with traditionalist conservatism, actually begins as the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, and William F. Buckley Jr. is the person that Frank Chodorov picks to be the first president of ISI. So this label was very important back in the day. Now, over time, the label individualist comes to be hijacked by left-wing types during the 1960s, by persons who see individualism not as the kind of austere, disciplined libertarianism that you might associate with an Albert J. Nock or with a young William F. Buckley, but instead with just pure hedonism, a hedonism which is often aligned with statism. So individualism comes to be this cultural label rather than a political label. But when it was a political label and when it meant libertarianism, that was what William F. Buckley Jr. described himself as being. By the way, his affinity for libertarian labels continues until quite late in his life. So in 1993, he publishes a collection of columns under the title Happy Days, We're Here Again. And the subtitle of that was Reflections of a Libertarian Journalist. So Buckley saw himself as a libertarian journalist, even in the twilight days of his career in the 1990s. Well, those are labels. But let's talk about the substance of William F. Buckley's character and his thought, and his role as a public figure, and his views about the connection between the social order, religion, and the state. Well, first of all, there certainly is a conservative side to William F. Buckley Jr., and most of all, this is apparent in his devout Catholicism. So in religion, there's no question, William F. Buckley Jr. is very much a conservative. He is a very serious Catholic all throughout his life, as far as his personal devotion is concerned. But interestingly enough, if you look across a range of other fields, you'll find that Buckley is often at variance with the Catholic Church, and at variance with conservatism as it was understood before Buckley himself came to prominence and redefined it. So for example, in economics, Buckley is throughout his life something of a libertarian. He was criticized, in fact, for being too much of an economic libertarian by other conservatives at the time he published God and Man at Yale. So Peter Viereck, who is one of these fellows who in the late 1940s and early 1950s is part of a movement called the New Conservatives. Viereck publishes a book called Conservatism Revisited around 1949, which is one of the works that kicks off this conservative renaissance in the post-war era. Viereck was not the anti-statist, was not the economic libertarian that Bill Buckley was. And Viereck criticizes Buckley and says he's not actually entirely a conservative or even entirely a Catholic, because Viereck says Buckley's economics are in fact Calvinist. And Buckley's economics are in fact not those of a conservative, who traditionally would be more keep capitalism at an arm's length. That was more of the 19th century conservative view. No, instead, Buckley is much more of a Manchester liberal. In other words, what we would now call a classical liberal or a right liberal or a libertarian. And there were a whole variety of other conservatives of this era who also had quite a skeptical view of free market economics and what they considered to be Manchester liberalism. Certainly, this is true not only of Peter Viereck, but also of Clinton Rossiter. And while both of those individuals wind up being somewhat read out of the movement by Bill Buckley as he constructs a conservatism that is much more free market, in fact, even Russell Kirk, someone who is brought into National Review by Bill Buckley, even Russell Kirk was a critic of Manchester liberalism and of a sort of pure free market approach to economics. And if you look at other schools of conservative thought, either of the same period or slightly earlier, you will find there are these tensions between conservatism and free market economics. So, for example, the Southern agrarians would certainly not be considered, thoroughgoing capitalists. The Catholic social tradition, Catholic social teaching, Catholic views of capitalism are also rather distinct from those of Bill Buckley. So even though Buckley was not the one who comes up with this rather infamous quip, Mater si magistra no, which is a rejoinder to the title of a 1961 papal encyclical titled Mater et Magistra, even though Buckley doesn't coin the phrase Mater si magistra no, he's the one who adopts that as the title of an editorial in National Review and basically as the magazine's editorial line. And what it means is that National Review is devoted to the free market and thinks that papal social encyclicals like Mater et Magistra are misguided and can be rejected. Now, in economics, this is this deviation from other forms of conservatism, this deviation in the direction of libertarianism is fairly well known. So I think many of you will be familiar with this. But interestingly enough, in social policy as well, William F. Buckley Jr. often seems more like a libertarian than a traditional conservative. This even goes to an issue that is of prime importance for Roman Catholics and for many others as well, namely abortion. So in 1966, Bill Buckley publishes a syndicated column about, it's titled The Catholic Church and Abortion. And I draw attention to this not because the Bill Buckley of 1966 is rather open to the idea of legal abortion. He changes his mind about that, and in any case, abortion is not a defining issue that separates conservatives and libertarians. There are pro-life libertarians, and there are some conservatives who are not, against abortion rights. But what's interesting about this column of Buckley's, The Catholic Church and Abortion, is not that at the time he was relatively in favor of legal abortion, but rather that he argues in this column that Catholic and, generally speaking, religious Christian social teachings only are binding upon members of the religion itself. They are not, in fact, the lodestar for society as a whole, that society as a whole has to have a more secular public character. So in social policy, Buckley was not, in fact, always, in terms of his fundamental thinking about the relationship between church and state and overall society and religion, he was not necessarily more conservative than libertarian. He was, in fact, more libertarian. And of course, you can look at a number of other aspects as well. The fact that Buckley wrote prolifically and was very happy to write for Playboy magazine. You can look at Bill Buckley's attitude towards drugs. He was always in favor of the decriminalization of marijuana. He himself seems to have dabbled occasionally in harder substances as well. So in terms of both economic policy and social policy, Buckley is a better fit for libertarianism than he is for conservatism. Now, there's much more I can say. I imagine Michael will have a few words to say about foreign policy, which may seem to be something that separates Buckley and libertarians, and any number of other fields as well. But I will save that for my rejoinder. Thank you.
Before I invite Michael up, I should say you mentioned Playboy. This is one of William F. Buckley's great lines. As he was asked why, as a conservative, he wrote in Playboy, and he said it was the only way he could get through to his son. Michael.
Thank you, Dan. I have to admit, when I was preparing for this debate, I thought, I have the easy side. I mean, it's the conservative movement, right? I began digging in the last week and realizing that you would have a fun time with me, and you did make most of the points I anticipate. I think I need to concede up top tonight that William F. Buckley, if he stood in a pantheon of conservative intellectuals that stretches all the way back to Edmund Burke and Lord Salisbury, John Adams, onward to his contemporaries like Russell Kirk and Peter Viereck, people who post-dated him like Roger Scruton, Pierre Minette. Buckley stands out as the most libertarian among them. Conservatism was born as a defense of inherited institutions, including the church and the state. And Buckley occasionally, showing the influence of Albert Nock, referred to the state as the domestic enemy. Albert J. Nock was a little bit more extreme, just saying our enemy, the state. Buckley shared the libertarian enthusiasm for free markets, in part because of the buccaneering entrepreneurialism of his own father in Mexico. And it's true, I think Dan characterized it perfectly, most conservative intellectuals, going back to the 19th century and even to today, can only manage Irving Kristol's 2 cheers for capitalism rather than 3. Buckley was probably at 2.5, maybe 2 3/4. And of course, Buckley licensed Frank Meyer in National Review to craft an intellectual framework for a conservative and libertarian alliance in a movement that, in fact, they both needed each other. This was a necessity, but I don't think it ever confused Buckley about his intellectual priors or his persona. He wrote, distinguishing himself from others, conservatives, under the stress of our times, have had to invite all kinds of people into their ranks to help with the job at hand. And the natural courtesy of the conservative causes him to treat such people not as janissaries, but as equals, And so empirically, it becomes difficult to see behind the khaki, to know surely whether that is a conservative over there doing what needs to be done, or a radical, or merely a noisemaker or pyrotechnician, since our ragtag army sometimes moves together in surprising uniformity, and there are exhilarating moments when everyone's eye is to the right. Buckley's record is fundamentally one for conservatives. And I would say look no further than the books he published. In God at Men at Yale, yes, he argues for free enterprise, free markets, for individualism. But he also is arguing against academic freedom. I mean, this would now be the libertarian position today. He calls it a superstition and argues forcefully that the academics at Yale have a positive duty, an institutional duty, to defend and transmit Christian orthodoxy and adherence to America's political forms to their students. Where does he locate this duty? At times in the text, he seems to locate it in the mark of baptism itself, which many professors would have been baptized Christians. This is not someone who thinks you have a license to do whatever you want. He puts order and truth ahead of freedom. And this legacy informed by faith, which his son, he may have tried to reach his son Christopher Buckley in the pages of Playboy, but Christopher Buckley said after his father's death that the molten core of him was his faith in God. And so it was in one of his last books, in Nearer My God to Thee. He writes toward the very conclusion, free speech and private property are terrific, but they do not deal with the great ends of life. Lacking that, liberalism is at a grave disadvantage contending with secular religions that offer visions of comprehensive achievements. The rediscovery of sin as defined in the Bible would cause us to look up and note the infinite horizons that beckon us towards better conduct, better lives, nobler visions. Buckley would ask, can you be a conservative and despise God? I would say no, showing conservatism's roots in a transcendent order over atheistic liberty. In his public life, in his advocacy, yes, it's true, he was for marijuana legalization when marijuana was about 1,000 times more potent than it is today. He was for welfare reform and school choice when he ran for mayor, but he was also for technocratic nudges to improve the conditions of city life, like congestion pricing, or, for instance, adding more bike lanes or other beautification programs that had nothing to do with free markets. The gravitational force Buckley supplied to the conservative movement, anti-communism, faith in providence, gave even libertarian arguments a setting and consciousness that they could not generate for themselves. Libertarianism without Buckley would have remained alienated, crankish, bitter against tradition itself. A liberty under Buckley becomes liberty for a civilization. And that shift is not minor. It marks the difference between a libertarianism opposing authority as such and a conservative defense of ordered liberty. Daniel is right. I do want to address foreign policy. Anti-communism was the defining feature of William F. Buckley's life as a conservative, as a coalition builder. It stretches back to his childhood in Mexico, where his father was contending not just with the socialism of a communist regime, but its atheism. He would have been deeply influenced by the legendary figures of the Cristeros War, and he carried on this anti-communism into the future. When he talks about individualism, he's not just pulling this from the Enlightenment. He's setting this up against modern Marxism, which preaches collectivism. So he's not just, this is not a pure Rousseauian romantic man is born free and everywhere is in chains. He knew better. The anti-communism also shifted his views of government. By 1952, he's writing in Commonweal that in order to defeat and confront the Soviet Union, at least for a time, Americans would have to accept totalitarian government at home, including the intelligence agencies, domestic spying, propaganda, etc. He supported a large government spending as far as military is concerned and intervention. And, consider too the treatment he would give, say, foreign conservative or right-wing authoritarians. He would call a person like General Franco an authentic national hero. He would send a political reporter from National Review to chronicle the government of General Pinochet. Compare that to how he treated extreme libertarians. He published Whittaker Chambers savaging one of Ayn Rand's novels as akin to bidding millions of people into the gas chambers of the Third Reich. In an obituary for the libertarian Murray Rothbard, he compared that libertarian thinker to David Koresh and damned him as unable to handle moral priorities. He said things that a libertarian would never say. In a debate with John Hotspur's on Firing Line, he would criticize libertarianism's indifference to tradition as its key flaw. He would criticize small L liberalism or Manchesterism, saying it dethrones virtue in favor of liberation, and that a respect for prescription and prudence is the mark of a conservative. Buckley made conservatism respectable in a mass democracy without surrendering its emphasis on faith, inherited culture, and the obligations of order. We can argue with, Mark Lilla has argued very persuasively that there was a kind of individualist revolution in the 1960s on personal behavior that was followed by a kind of individualism in economic and market forces in the 1980s, a kind of a twin revolution in American life. And perhaps Buckley contributed to both of them in certain ways. But without Buckley, there would have been something missing. Reagan could recite more market slogans like anyone else, but he also borrowed from Buckley's cadence of gratitude for America's heritage and reverence for the transcendent. This gave a new horizon to conservatism that it wouldn't have otherwise had. And for that, we have to thank Buckley for preserving it through the contingencies of his time into ours. And for that, that's a fundamentally conservative legacy.
So Michael has actually made a very persuasive case that William F. Buckley Jr. was a Christian libertarian, that he was a right libertarian. He was not a left libertarian. He was not a hedonist. He was not an atheist libertarian. Nevertheless, you can find today any number of great examples of very strongly devout individuals, such as my friend Tom Woods, for example, who are both Roman Catholic and also libertarian, or any number of other Christian libertarians. In fact, it's kind of interesting. The Foundation for Economic Education, which may sound like a group of green eye shade folks coming together to talk about Adam Smith, actually had a very strong Christian element to it at the very beginning in the 1950s. So Christianity and libertarianism have a very interesting, complex relationship with one another, and Bill Buckley fits into that. And Bill Buckley was basically, because of his religious devotion, he was someone that conservatives of the old school could accept as a genuine conservative, but his approach to economics was very much a break from what had been characteristic of conservatives before. What he basically did was to import libertarian economics into conservatism, in part through the testimony of his faith. That is because he had his faith to, mark him as a conservative in his religious views in his personal life. He had a degree of credibility in making other conservatives say, you know what, maybe we have to rethink economics, maybe we have to become libertarians in our economics. Now, Michael has brought up foreign policy as a major division between libertarians and conservatives, perhaps. And he's also brought up this interesting question of academic freedom. So in terms of foreign policy, there actually was a spectrum of libertarian opinion during the Cold War. And many libertarians, including Buckley's friend Frank Chodorow, who is the founding father of this philosophy called fusionism, but who was, I think, accurately characterized by the arch-libertarian Murray Rothbard as really being a libertarian monkey, as being a libertarian, at heart. Frank Meyer was also a very strong anti-communist, and numerous other libertarians throughout the Cold War were. By the way, if we think it's unusual that libertarians might have a favorable view of Francisco Franco or of Augusto Pinochet, we should remember that Milton Friedman himself was, an advisor to Chile's government, that Friedrich Hayek was as well, that in fact there is a strong degree of libertarian support for what is, somewhat controversially called transitional dictatorship. This idea that an authoritarian like Pinochet may actually be necessary to stave off communism and to bring about a more free society after a certain period of military rule. In any event, those are complexities. I will note, by the way, even if we say that the libertarian center of gravity with respect to foreign policy is on the side of non-interventionism, which I think is generally fair to say, like I say, the Cold War is something of an exception, but in general, libertarians don't like foreign wars. But then again, neither did Bill Buckley. And in fact, both before the Cold War, in World War II, Bill Buckley has a strongly libertarian commitment to keeping America out of the Second World War. He's very much aligned with people like Nock and Chodorov. But then after the Cold War, Bill Buckley also returns to the libertarian center of gravity. After the Cold War, Buckley becomes increasingly skeptical of America's use of military power abroad, ultimately reaching a point where he is very critical of the Iraq War. People who knew him personally attest that he was really quite appalled by the Iraq War. Although, by that point in his life, he doesn't want to be seen as simply a spoiler trying to ruin George W. Bush's reputation. Even so, Buckley does, take to the pages of his column and of National Review occasionally, making a case against American interventionism abroad in the Iraq War. So his libertarianism even applies to his foreign policy, both before the Cold War, even during the Cold War, and then certainly after the Cold War as well. Finally, I'll say a few words about the influence of someone we haven't mentioned yet, which is Wilmore Kendall, who was one of Buckley's mentors at Yale University. And Kendall was very much not a libertarian. Kendall was very much a believer in, at first, majoritarian rule. He certainly believes in the people over things like property rights and the concerns that libertarians have. Wilmore Kendall was much more of a populist, whereas Buckley, by his upbringing and by nature too, was much more of an aristocrat in his outlook. Wilmore Kendall has a profound effect on Buckley, and there's no doubt about that, and that includes influencing Buckley's views on higher education and academic freedom. That said, it's worth remembering God and Man at Yale is pressing not only for Yale to return to its Christian roots, but also, and somewhat controversially because they somewhat contradict those Christian roots, to embrace free market capitalism as well. So again, you find that Buckley's Christianity is always accompanied by this other side, by this very strong commitment to free market economics, which is not derived from his Christianity, but in fact is a freestanding thing. I shouldn't say it's not derived at all from his Christianity. There is a relationship, but he's clearly devoted to, again, what Viereck had described as being a rather more Calvinist view of economics rather than a Catholic one or a traditionally conservative one. I could give you a sophisticated interpretation of what libertarians actually say about institutions of higher education. Private institutions of higher education certainly are free to adopt policies other than academic freedom. And in fact, libertarians strongly urge that certain institutions of higher education should adopt pro-liberty curricula rather than having academic freedom that may allow a drift into socialism. By the way, I'll just wrap up by saying Thomas Jefferson himself had that view. Thomas Jefferson wanted to purge the University of Virginia of books that were too Tory and instead have Whiggish histories.
Just a quick note, Michael, feel free to rebut, but there should be little cards, if you haven't noticed, on your seats, and you can fill them in with questions, which is the next section. Michael, we have 6 minutes for rebuttal.
Let's see, where to begin? Conservatism, this is a Buckley quote, conservatism aims to maintain in working order the loyalties of the community, to perceive truths and to those truths which in their judgment have earned universal recognition. I've always believed that conservatism is the politics of reality, and that reality ultimately asserts itself in a reasonably free society in behalf of a conservative position. When William F. Buckley opposed entry into World War II, so did the vast majority of conservatives, so did the vast majority of Americans. When he came around to increase skepticism of the Iraq War, his critique of it was fundamentally a conservative critique. He would say that idealism has its place in foreign policy, but when the costs come due, there are limits even to this. It was fundamentally a conservative idea about limits, about what can be achieved by the state, and not just the state, but by man himself. Accepting this crooked timber. William F. Buckley was also, I think both of us are saying something very similar, that there's a capaciousness to Buckley that doesn't exist in other individuals. It's part of his aristocratic bearing. It's part of his behavior. And that includes at times, yes, he sounds as libertarian as the libertarians. He could also be a kind of populist. I mean, when he supported Joe McCarthy early in his career, doing so was considered gauche in a way that I think most conservatives would recognize these days when it was early to support Donald Trump. I think actually supporting McCarthy when Buckley did was actually an even harder task at the time. Buckley was obviously also very adaptable in his conservatism, because conservatism tries to throw away just bare political axioms. You saw in the 1970s that he did actually moderate somewhat, and he began socializing, much to the chagrin of his fellows at National Review, with not only Nixonites, but with Rockefeller Republicans, in trying to keep his party together and united going forward. I will say, though, that, this Magister Si, or Mater Si, Magister No, so mother yes, teacher no attitude toward the church, this is something that's common among traditionalist Catholics, viewing the Catholic Church as having a deposit of faith and dogma that is unchallengeable and unquestionable, but that the political and social opinions of any given pontiff are not so sealed with infallible authority. And in fact, very few Catholics maintain, except the most ultramontanists, maintain that a social encyclical has the same standing as an ecumenical council. If they did, then Catholicism has recently descended in recent decades into a cacophony of confusion and contradiction. If there's no liberty on these matters, then of judgment, then the church and his faith is doomed. As far as Buckley's more liberal attitude to drugs, this does not extend to public disorder or anything else. He was a firm backer of police power to make streets safe and livable, an opponent of crime. He was simply not, and also there was a kind of cultural aspect to Buckley in his person that stood for things beyond politics. I mean, one kind of the major truths of conservatism is that not everything is reducible to politics. He stood up for high culture. He famously performed on the harpsichord in New York at famous concerts. He would, if you were so lucky to be invited to his home, you might be treated to a concert by the Yale Whiffenpoofs or some other classical formation or group. He was a patron of the arts. And, he was fundamentally, like all conservatives must be, an opponent of conventional wisdom. I mean, he would say that the largest cultural menace in America is the conformity of the intellectual cliques which, in education as well as the arts, are out to impose upon their nation their modish fads and fallacies, and having nearly succeeded in doing so. In this cultural issue, we are without reservation on the side of excellence rather than newness, and to honest intellectual combat rather than conformity. This is fundamentally his attitude toward the world. It's the attitude of other, even liberal conservatives and liberal conservative Catholics like G.K. Chesterton, that they're for the enduring and against the ephemeral.
All right, thank you both. So I don't know if the cards are going to be collected. In the meantime, I'm going to start with a question of my own. One of my favorite things that I get in my inbox is emails that begin, William F. Buckley will be rolling over in his grave, and then I have to scroll down to find out why. Because sometimes it's because I'm too this way, sometimes it's because I'm too that way. And I've said to Rich Lowry before, what we need on National Review's website is a little needle like they have on the New York Times, which says every day whether we are Donald Trump sycophant MAGA types or William F. Buckley disappointing left-wing communists. It's difficult to tell. So my question is, if we bring forward 100 years after his birth, William F. Buckley's legacy, where do you think he would be now? Do you think he would be happy in our current politics? Do you think he would, like some of my interlocutors say, be rolling over in his grave? Do you think that he would side with one group or another, or would he be trying to find a third way? How do you see him now in the relative to this debate, conservative, libertarian, and so forth?
Well, there are two ways to approach that. I think intellectually, if we assume that Bill Buckley would have today the same sort of grounding, the same sort of foundations and principle that he had during his actual life, 100 years, which began 100 years ago, that he would indeed be on the side of those very critical of, for example, the United States buying shares in Intel, various things that the Trump administration is doing, which National Review has been very critical of. So in that sense, I think Buckley would be consistent as a libertarian conservative or a conservatarian who would be critical of the Trump administration. Now, as Michael had said, Buckley was also pragmatic, and I think he would recognize there's a reason why Trump keeps succeeding where other Republican candidates have failed, both within the Republican Party, among its own constituency, and also in getting elected. So Buckley would have some degree of, he would not write off, I think, Donald Trump, but he would continue to criticize where he stands and what he's doing in policy, especially in economic policy, especially in the realm of protectionism. The other way of approaching this question, however, in around the year 2000, there was a internet publication called Lingua Franca, and Bill Buckley gave a wonderful interview with this publication where he was asked exactly this question. So it's 2000, it's the Bush era, the second Bush era, George W. Bush, is about to begin. Bush is clearly the rising star of the Republican Party. And Bill Buckley, who's already, he's 8 years away from his death, he's asked, well, who would you be if you were born today? Who would you be if Bill Buckley was coming of age in the year 2000? And Buckley says, I think I would be on the left. He says that because he thinks that the conservative movement by the year 2000 had become very boring. And clearly, if you look at Bill Buckley's character and spirit, especially as a young man, he loved the controversy, he loved the combat of ideas. And so he might have rebelled against any era, and he might, be a young MAGA, Trump supporter. He might be someone who found that to be energizing and invigorating in a way that this kind of stale old establishment that Trump is tearing down is not. So I think the rebellious streak in Buckley would lend him towards being somewhat interested in Trump, but his intellectual principles would lead him to be quite anti-Trump.
Interesting. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, Bill Buckley displayed such a variety of attitudes toward figures in power that, in some ways we're amazed at how harsh National Review could be on Eisenhower, who in retrospect seems so conservative, partly because of his placidness. But there was a hunger in the conservative right then for someone who would tear down the New Deal, which Eisenhower wasn't interested in. But then, later there's great enthusiasm for Reagan in public. In private, Buckley wrote a lot of letters to Reagan questioning his foreign policy, whether he was temporizing with the Soviet Union, and questioning whether, he was really a kind of peacenik in disguise. And in his very late life, he seems to have credited Reagan with a farsightedness that he did not have in the 1980s for what was possible with the Soviet Union. So it's very difficult to say. I mean, when I made the analogy between Trump and Joseph McCarthy, I think that's perfectly valid. But at the same time, I could easily imagine Buckley, at least privately, being disgusted with Trump at times, as he was disgusted with, say, Nixon glad-handing Chairman Mao. Buckley said he wanted to reach for the sick bucket when Nixon was comparing the greatness of the Chinese Communist Party to the greatness of the United States.
All right, this is a fantastic question, and I think it is especially so given how scrambled our politics are, and it's on a topic that you guys have touched on to some extent. How would Buckley's opinions on foreign policy translate to today's conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East? Daniel.
That's a very good question. One aspect of that is, would Buckley see Vladimir Putin's Russia as a direct successor to the Soviet Union, and a reconfigured Soviet Union, perhaps a country that aspires to rebuild the empire that Gorbachev had lost? On the other hand, Buckley, he saw the path that America had taken in Afghanistan and even more in Iraq, and was very disillusioned by the failures there. Buckley had been Buckley was, didn't have a sharp view, I think, of the first Gulf War. I think he was mildly supportive of it. But in the pages of National Review, you could find many critics of the first Gulf War, including Joe Sobran, including Florence King, John O'Sullivan to some degree. So there was an interesting debate happening about where American foreign policy should go in the early 1990s. And then as you get to the mid to late 2000s, in the very last years of Buckley's life, as Michael said, Buckley actually revisits the Reagan years, and he says, Reagan was right and I was wrong. Reagan was actually more far-sighted in looking to cut a deal with the Soviet Union and looking to end the Cold War and to end the threat of nuclear weapons, rather than Buckley, who was more hawkish. Similarly, with respect to the Iraq War, Buckley saw it as a complete mismanagement and failure. So if that's the case, then if you extend those views of both what Reagan did with Russia and also the failure of what seemed at times like it might have been a good cause in Iraq, you could see that Buckley might very well be skeptical of getting deeply involved in Ukraine. He would be appalled by what Russia's doing, but I don't know that he would see that America would have a solution to the problem.
I think I won't belabor the point Stan made. I think that's very cogent. I think it fundamentally comes down to whether Buckley would have viewed NATO's post-Cold War life as an extension and achievement that conservatives should continue to build on, or whether he viewed them as institutions that had been captured by the left and by their previous enemies. People like Jens Stoltenberg grew up in families who were protesting the Cold War, and now he's running NATO. There's just the German Green Party was a force for temporizing with the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and now is NATO's greatest source of support in Germany, because many Europeans fundamentally see this as a liberal progressive project now. So how would Buckley see it? I don't know. I think that's the divide that runs through the American right presently, and I think it's actually impossible to know where he would come down.
All right, maybe the big question: where do the two of you stand on fusionism?
I'll put in a plug. ISI has just published a new biography of Frank Meyer. It's called The Man Who Invented Conservatism. Of course, the truth is Frank Meyer actually invented fusionism, which is a philosophy for bringing together libertarians and traditionalists. But the book is called The Man Who Invented Conservatism because that's a sexier title. And the author, by the way, is a brilliant writer, brilliant historian named Daniel Flynn. So I highly commend that book to you. And what's interesting there, so first of all, Flynn is a biographer who is sympathetic to the right, certainly, he's conservative, but he's actually not necessarily a fusionist. So the book is interesting as a look at fusionism by someone with an objective eye. And one of the interesting, theses of the book is that what Frank Meyer tries to do with fusionism in bringing together traditionalists and libertarians within the conservative movement is actually inspired by Frank Meyer's earlier time as a communist. Because the American Communist Party back in the 1930s and occasionally at other times had tried to redefine communism as 20th century Americanism. And there was this effort to, show that communism was not this foreign influence, but in fact was part of the grain of the American character. And so Flynn argues that fusionism was actually trying to use the same sort of strategy with respect to conservatism and libertarianism, bringing them together, showing that they were both, in fact, part of the grain of American history. All of that may seem like it's off to the side, but actually, I think fusionism should be looked at with fresh eyes for this reason, that not because it might have, parallels to something the Communist Party was trying to do at one point, but rather because it actually is a serious attempt to grapple with the complexities of the American tradition, of the modern West, and to look at the ways in which virtue and liberty, freedom and order have interacted with one another. So I think fusionism, understood as a good faith effort to see how these themes relate to one another, is actually very important even now. In terms of being a political program or a kind of shallow ideology, or God help us, this three-legged stool. I just wrote an essay for Chronicles magazine criticizing this idea of a three-legged stool. That I think is all passé and maybe was even a bad idea to begin with. But this deeper idea of how do you reconcile liberty and order, that's very important, and I give Frank Meyer credit for his attempt to grapple with that.
I mean, I think Brett Bozell Jr.'s criticism launched at Fusionism in Triumph magazine was pretty devastating when you revisit it as a philosophy. At the same time, as a kind of working reality rather than a philosophy, I actually think it's kind of inevitable, and it constantly reproduces itself on odd levels. So, for instance, we have the mainstream institutions of the conservative movement, or if you even like that phrase, practice a kind of fusionism where there are libertarian contributors and more traditionalist contributors. But then you've had institutions, and Dan, you and I are both very familiar with them, paleo-conservative and paleo-libertarian, and they agree on a couple of things, maybe foreign policy, and then disagree about roles of government, about industrial policy, about everything else. They reproduce this same kind of libertarian conservative alliance just on different terms. And I think you can see this, just repeating itself over and over again. It's in a way like fusionism both makes no sense, and yet it is the very air we breathe, and it's inescapable.
All right, we'll do the last question before we do closing remarks. And I'll ask this one, which is more off the beaten path, because I don't want to impinge upon your closing statements. How do Christian libertarians, there was a phrase that was used earlier, balance bringing people to Christ with allowing people to do what they wish? That was a deep question.
Well, of course, Christianity is not predicated on coercion. So, spreading the gospel is something that has to be done, by taking people seriously as souls, as intellects, and evangelizing them, which is exactly, of course, what Christ's apostles do. They don't start out with any degree of political power. On the contrary, they are very much, persecuted by political power. Then the question, might be asked, well, there's this argument between conservatives, Christian conservatives on the one hand, Christian libertarians on the other, about the prospect and possibility of using state power to advance Christianity. And I would say that, even there you will see a certain amount of middle ground, actually, where Christian libertarians will certainly not have this extreme secularizing, basically, a Christian libertarian would say that much of the secularism that was built in the 20th century, was imposed on us in the 20th century, came from the state. It came from Supreme Court rulings. It came from what was going on in the public schools. All of these things were, forms of state imposition of a void, a blankness, where there had been a Christian culture. And if you did not have the state and its, apparatus of management doing this, then in the 20th century, America would have remained a Christian country. Now, I do think Christian libertarians face a very difficult challenge in the 21st century, because at this point, the changes wrought by a very aggressively secularist state in the 20th century have basically de-Christianized America. You still have, nominally at least, a Christian majority in America. America lost its Protestant majority about 10 years ago. And there's, although there are encouraging signs that more and more young people are being drawn to Latin Mass Catholicism and to very traditionalist forms of Christianity, there are also a lot of people dropping away from the faith. So this category of nuns keeps, N-O-N-E-S, keeps growing. So I think, Christian libertarians in the 21st century, I don't have an answer for them about what they would do, but I certainly can say that they actually did have intelligent things to say about the role of the state in attacking Christianity in the 20th century.
I won't belabor the point. Christian faith is a gift of the Holy Spirit, and the state cannot simply communicate that to a believer. That is a transaction between God and the individual soul. Obviously, it's mediated through history, and there is a political dimension to history. It doesn't matter what our rulers say and think and how that influences us, and the law is a teacher. But yeah, there's fundamentally you can't. There's no mechanism for the state to create Christian faith. It can nurture it. It can provide educational resources. It can do all that, but only God can provide the Spirit.
All right, so we're going to move now to closing statements. Daniel, I will invite you to go first.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, I will just reiterate that William F. Buckley Jr. is the founding father of libertarian conservatism, and the reason why conservatism is so often thought of as simply being a form of right liberalism or a form of classical liberalism. You'll often hear people say that American conservatism specifically is simply classical liberalism. The reason people have those impressions is very much because of William F. Buckley Jr., both his own work, but also the work that he did in creating National Review as an institution. And National Review has always championed free markets. It's always championed a rather more libertarian or liberal version of conservatism compared to some of these hard right publications that in many cases were quite. They could be all over the map. So Michael Dougherty mentioned Triumph magazine, which was Brent Bozell's small, very Catholic publication. And Triumph was basically a kind of integralist magazine before that term was, being used in its current form. And National Review obviously stood apart from that. Bozell quite consciously separated himself from National Review and its universe. Interestingly enough, so did Wilmore Kendall. So Wilmore Kendall, despite his influence on Buckley and his, tendency to give the aristocratic Buckley a little bit of a populist side as well, Kendall also winds up being something of an exile from National Review. So National Review itself, I think, stands, and even though National Review is indeed a spectrum, it has both Charlie Cooke and also Michael Brendan Dougherty among its contributors, Dominic Pino and any number of others. I think it is fair to say Michael is in a minority at National Review, and that the center of gravity at the magazine William F. Buckley Jr. founded is in fact on the libertarian side, certainly, of economic questions.
I won't dispute Dan's categorization of the state of play at National Review presently. I would just say it was not always thus. There was a time when, in fact, the intellectual ferment in National Review, I think, was a little bit wider, and partly because Buckley himself was wider than one little strand of thought or one label. And that's why we've been able to have this debate and kind of, I think, celebrate his legacy and its capaciousness. But I mean, you look at the debates, Wilmore Kendall was a kind of populist who thought conservatism was something that Americans walked within their hips. It wasn't this kind of bow ties and loafers and stale chicken dinners thing. It was a way of life. Similarly, James Burnham, an anti-communist who, reputedly, according to one biography, accepted the grace of the sacraments of the Catholic Church upon his death, pioneered materialist analysis on behalf of conservative ends and in defense of the Western civilization that he still believed in. Whittaker Chambers was no libertarian. Russell Kirk, other famous contributors to NR throughout the years, from Keith Minow to Florence King, are not easily categorized as libertarians, even if they detested the progressive capture of the state and its institutions. Fundamentally, Buckley called himself a conservative. He also very occasionally and more rarely called himself a libertarian. He rooted the duties of himself and others in a transcendent moral order that was located in his faith. This provided a dimension to conservatism in America that it might not have had at the end of the 20th century, if not for him and for National Review putting it forward. It's very easy to imagine the Republican Party sort of degenerating in the 1980s into what, say, the Liberal Democrats became in the United Kingdom, which is just sort of notional commitments to free markets when it's popular, a practical defense of the inherited state that they've had anyway. We've seen this in the deformations under George W. Bush and others. Bill Buckley gave the conservative movement real principles and a real transcendent horizon. And he is the one who swallowed the libertarians into his movement, not they into theirs. And that's where I'll conclude.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Michael, for this evening's debate.